research paper. You can access it at yaqeeninstitute.org. Yaqeen Institute, for those who are not familiar, is the organization that both I work for, and Dr. Nazir, of course, is the president of the Canada branch of it. It is an institute that is focused on doing three things for the Muslim community. Of course, masajid, Islamic schools, Islamic institutions, they need resources. And so Yaqeen is hoping to provide resources for those institutions, wherever they may be, to focus on nurturing the iman of Muslims in the West, dismantling the doubts that Muslims in the West have about their faith, and inspiring them to contribute in meaningful ways. So inshallah, you find this presentation to be a part of that vision of Yaqeen. And I also encourage everyone to go to that website for further resources. We have infographics, animations, videos, research articles. There's curriculum for youth groups, and for an entire gamut of Muslims and non-Muslims. So inshallah, with that, I'd like to give the mic to Dr. Nazir.
Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salam ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala. Allahumma alimna ma yanfa'na wa zidna ilma. Ameen ya Rabbil Alameen. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Jazakumullah khairan for inviting me to join you, to visit your beautiful community here, and to share with you this presentation. As Sheikh Uthman was mentioning, essentially what Yaqeen Institute is trying to do is we look at what are the main questions that are occurring to people. You know, the Muslim youth growing up today, they're confronted with so many different questions, areas of confusion, problems and challenges for their identity, to hold on to their identity and say, this is what it means to be a Muslim today. And so we look at those questions, and then we bring the scholars together, we bring the thought leaders together, we bring the experts and intellectuals in a wide variety of fields, and form that think tank that provides the answers to those questions that Muslims are going through today. One of the questions that Muslims are constantly confronted with, especially in Western society, is this narrative that Islam is a religion of violence. Okay? We're constantly confronted with this, and as Muslims we have to always be defending our religion against these accusations of violence. And we see so many people committing violence in the name of religion, and we're asked to justify, what does Islam say about this? Oftentimes there's very superficial answers. Okay, so you have the people who are against Islam who will just say, yes, Islam is the cause of violence. And then there's a superficial answer often that Muslims give, which is, you know, we mention Islam is peace, but we don't explain then why is this violence happening? And so people are left unsatisfied. So that's something that we want to explore in today's talk, inshallah ta'ala. So I want to begin with, you know, going back to the question of violence and the question of bloodshed. SubhanAllah, if you think about it, it's actually the very first topic that's mentioned in the very first story in the Quran. The very first story in the Quran is the story of our origin as human beings. It's a story about something that happened before human beings were even created. It's a conversation between Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the angels in Surah Al-Baqarah, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions to the angels, Inni ja'inun fil ardi khalifa. Verily I'm going to create on this earth a khalifa. And the angels, they ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, أَتَجْعَلُ فِيهَا مَن يُفْسِدُ فِيهَا وَيَسْفِكُ الدِّمَاءِ. Are you going to create that creation that is going to do corruption and shed blood, that's going to commit bloodshed? So one of the things that the angels identify as being such an evil that they see it as a reason why human beings should not even exist is the phenomenon of bloodshed, the phenomenon of violence. They viewed the shedding of blood to be something that would preclude even bringing human beings into existence. And what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells them is, Inni a'lamu ma la ta'lamun. I know that which you do not know. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala demonstrates to the angels the virtue of Adam alayhi salam with knowledge, with understanding. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells the angels, A'lamu ma tubduna wa ma kuntum taktumun. I know that which you make apparent and what you're concealing. What the angels are making apparent is the destructive capacity of the human beings, right? When they mention that a creature that is going to do bloodshed and corruption, what is not being made apparent is the constructive capacity of human beings, right? The ability of human beings to journey closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and obtain the highest level of virtue in their spirituality, in their relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and then in their relationship with the creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So that is the goal of Islam, and that goal is we gain that from the very first story in the Quran. This idea that as human beings, we are living a worthy existence when we're journeying towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to develop virtues. And we're gaining an existence that is evil if we're on the path of corruption and committing of bloodshed. And the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, لن يزال المؤمن في فسحة من دينه ما لم يصب دما حراما. Right? That a believer only remains sound in his or her faith so long as he or she does not shed blood, does not commit any unlawful action. So this establishes the ethics of Islam concerning peace and violence. And the first act of violence in the history of human beings, we see again the Quranic ethics embodied in that, and that's the story of Habil and Qabil, right? The sons of Adam alayhi salam, right? When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala narrates to us this story where Qabil kills his own brother, and then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, "Min ajli dharik." On that account, كتبنا على بني إسرائيل أنه من قتل نفسا بغير نفس أو فساد في الأرض فكأنما قتل الناس جميعا. It was because of that we ordained for Bani Israel that whoever commits the act of murder, whoever kills a person unjustly, then it is as if they have killed all of humanity. وَمَنْ أَحْيَاهَا فَكَأَنَّمَا أَحْيَا النَّاسَ جَمِيعًا. And whoever saves a life, it is as if they have saved all of humanity. And the Prophet Muhammad said, when you're in that time of tribulation, what did the Prophet tell us to do? He said, be like the son of Adam. Referring to who? Referring to Habil alayhi salam. Referring to this ethic of non-violence. So this is the Islamic aspiration that the human being has, to avoid the chaos and bloodshed in this worldly life and devote oneself purely for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But at the same time, of course, we have a concept of justice. We cannot allow injustice to spread, and wrongdoing and transgression to happen, and the rights of people to be violated. And therefore there is the concept of the just exercise of force, the just usage of force in Islamic ethics, and actually in world ethics. When you study the concept of just warfare in political theory, you see the exact same concepts that are being mentioned by the fuqaha of Islam, the Muslim jurists. And there's an entire article on just warfare in Islam on the Yaqeen website. So we now come to this question that people always ask: is Islam a religion of violence? And there's an animated video that's been summarized from the article. And I'll just play this video for you, not because it gives me an easy break from speaking, but because it also shows you some of the work that we're doing at Yaqeen Institute. We do the research and then translate that research, for people who can't read a 30, 40-page article. There's a simple animated video that you can share with your friends, with your colleagues, neighbors. Somebody asks you this question: well, why are people committing violence in the name of Islam? And you have a simple video that you can refer them to. So I'll play this video, inshallah ta'ala. We'll see if this works.
By Dr. Nazir Khan. Is Islam a religion of violence? Based on an article by Dr. Nazir Khan. The Prophet said, "Worship God the most merciful and spread peace." Muslims believe that Islam clearly condemns violence, but with so much violence committed in the name of religion, many people believe that religion itself is to blame. Some people even think that humanity would be better off without religion, and that religion hinders peace. But a quick look at history shows why this view is factually incorrect. World War I was not about religion, but nationalism. It claimed the lives of 15 million people. World War II was about fascism, and up to 80 million people were killed. Soviet atheism was explicitly against religion, but it resulted in more violence and deaths than any religious battle in human history. 62 million people were murdered under the Soviet regime. And in the past century, European colonialism resulted in the deaths of 50 million people. The bottom line is that it doesn't matter whether an ideology is religious or non-religious. Any ideology becomes a cause for violence when it is imposed by force or when it is used to dehumanize others. And dehumanization, or the denial of the humanity of others, is the step that permits killing with impunity. Today we often see people accusing Muslims of violence because terrorist groups carry out violence in the name of Islam. On the one hand, we have the mainstream followers of Islam, 1.8 billion people, who believe that Islam is a religion of peace and justice. On the other hand, we have a modern terrorist organization that is using the same five-letter word, Islam, to refer to their violent ideology. When the media uses the word Islam to refer to that violent ideology instead of the peaceful faith of Muslim families around the world, the media ends up siding with the terrorist narrative. This ignores the way 1.8 billion mainstream followers of Islam understand their faith. The mainstream followers who have the right to inform others about what Islam actually means. When we talk about Christianity, we don't consider terrorist organizations like the Lord's Resistance Army in Uganda or the Ku Klux Klan to be the true representatives of what Christianity is. Instead, we go to the mainstream followers of the faith and the consensus of their religious leaders. To mainstream Muslims around the world, Islam represents a spiritual journey towards God through worshiping Him alone and caring for all of God's creation. Mainstream Muslims believe in upholding the values of compassion and mercy as embodied in the Quran and through the practice of the Prophet, peace be upon him. The Quran is very clear in condemning acts of violence and aggression in numerous passages. But terrorists and Islamophobes alike both try to misquote a handful of verses in order to portray Islam as violent. For example, chapter 2, verse 191 is the most frequently misquoted Quranic passage. It is argued that the Quran says, "Kill them wherever you find them." But look at the verses immediately before and after. "Fight in the cause of God those who fight you, and do not commit aggression. Verily, God does not love those who transgress. So kill them, that is your attackers, wherever you find them, and drive them out from where they have driven you out. But if they cease in fighting, then let there be no hostility except against the oppressors." All of a sudden, it becomes crystal clear that this phrase is referring only to those waging war against you. In fact, the great scholar and cousin of the Prophet, Ibn Abbas, said that this verse means do not attack women, children, elderly, or anyone who is not fighting against you. Sounds exactly like the kind of statement terrorists and Islamophobes will conveniently ignore. Terrorists who use Islam to further their agenda completely disregard any textual and historical context, ignore reputable Islamic scholars, consistently cherry-pick portions of verses to suit their agenda, and even violate the literal command of other explicit texts in the Quran, like the verse, "There is no compulsion in religion." So the terrorists have constructed their own violent ideology they call Islam, but it actually goes against everything that you find in the sources of real Islam, the Holy Quran, and the teachings of the Prophet. The trouble is, the media and many politicians parrot the terrorist narrative by referring to violent criminal groups as radical Islamists, Islamic extremists, and Islamic terrorists. The result, whenever anyone sees a terrorist attack, the one common word everyone instantly thinks of is Islam. Most people agree that the vast majority of the 1.8 billion Muslims are not causing violence. But by using the same word that describes the faith of these 1.8 billion people, they end up lumping them into the same group as the terrorists. So, is Islam a religion of violence? Here are two important conclusions. Number one, Islam categorically denounces violence. The real Islam found in the Quran and the teachings of the Prophet is the same Islam followed by a global faith community of 1.8 billion people who uphold the values of compassion and justice, as we find in numerous verses of the Quran and sayings of the Prophet. It is not the Islam of terrorists. Terrorists manipulate and exploit the religion to serve their own agenda. Even though they use the same word, Islam, they are referring to something completely different, which contradicts everything that mainstream Islam stands for. And number two, religion does not beget violence. Violent movements use whatever ideology they can to further their agenda, whether it's religious or non-religious, including nationalism, fascism, white supremacism, and communism. Any ideology can become an ideology of violence if people use it to dehumanize others. It is ideologies of dehumanization that encourage violence, whereas the Islamic faith of 1.8 billion people around the world preaches peace and compassion.
That was a long video, wasn't it? 6 minutes and a half. All right, so that kind of summarizes the basic narrative that people construct around Islam and violence, and deconstructing that narrative and looking at, how are we actually using the word Islam? Whose Islam are we talking about? That famous article that came out when Daesh was in the news, what ISIS really wants, right? And it starts with this provocative title, ISIS is Islamic, very Islamic. Well, according to whose definition of Islam? According to the journalist's definition of Islam? What gives that individual the right to define Islam, rather than the understanding of Islam that's espoused by 1.8 billion Muslims? So that's the first thing that we have to look at. The second thing is, when we look at how Islamophobes construct their narrative, we see the same common fallacies being used over and over again. So, for example, this was a very common sentiment that certain Islamophobes will use. To take one example, Sam Harris's statement, there are hundreds of millions of Muslims who are nominal Muslims, who don't take the faith seriously, who don't want to kill apostates, who are horrified by ISIS, and we need to defend these people, prop them up, and let them reform their faith. Okay? So what he's basically saying is that the peaceful Muslims are just nominal Muslims. They're just fake Muslims. The violent Muslims, like ISIS, are the real Muslims. They're the ones who take their faith seriously. So according to this understanding, he's suggesting that he has the right to determine who is the real Muslim and who is the fake Muslim, right? So according to him, when scholars of Islam gathered together to issue fatwa condemning violence done in the name of Islam, these are all just fake Muslims. That's how they dismiss them, right? All these scholars of Islam, no, they're just fake Muslims. They don't take their religion seriously. But they dedicated their life to studying Islam. No, they're fake Muslims. When the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, which represents 57 countries around the Muslim world, and they issue a collective statement against violence, no, these are just fake Muslims. They don't take their religion seriously. Okay, so who are the ones who take their religion seriously? Oh, those are the people who are the hijackers who go and they visit the strip clubs before they go and commit their violent actions. They're the ones who take their religion seriously. The ones who visit this Pink Pony Club and this and that. Those are, according to him, those are the true Muslims. The people who went to join ISIS, and the last books that they order from Amazon are Quran for Dummies, Islam for Dummies. Those are the true Muslims according to them. So this narrative that the Islamophobes construct is they get to decide who's a true Muslim and who's a fake Muslim. If you're peaceful, then you're a fake Muslim. No, you don't really count. But if you're somebody who's violent, it doesn't matter what your religiosity is, your level of adherence to Islamic teachings, how much you care about Islam. No, as long as you're violent, then you're taking the religion seriously. Then you're considered a true Muslim. So it's to the extent that even Western agencies that examine this phenomenon, they say, far from being religious zealots, a large number of those involved in terrorism do not practice their faith regularly. Many lack religious literacy and could actually be regarded as religious novices. Very few have been brought up in strongly religious households, and there are higher than average proportion of converts. Some are involved in drug taking, drinking alcohol, and visiting prostitutes. There is evidence that a well-established religious identity actually protects against violent radicalization. So the problem comes is that when people don't have a secure religious identity and they're faced with this crisis of identity, I feel like my faith and my identity is under attack, and if the person doesn't have a secure religious identity, they don't have a secure attachment to their community, then where are the resources of support for that individual? What happens to that individual? They become especially prone and vulnerable to violent ideation. And that can be one of the ramifications of that. Now, what about movements? That may happen at the individual level, but what about violent movements? Where do violent movements come from? So, you know, as you saw in the video, when people blame religion for violence, they're ignoring the fact that human beings have committed violence in the name of so many different things, right? Yeah, human beings have committed violence in the name of nationalism, fascism, secular ideologies, non-religious ideologies. Some of the biggest killers in human history, you know, where you're talking about like 70 million people, 60 million people, people who commit democide, which is when a government kills its own citizens. You look at these massive amounts of numbers of people that they've killed. This is not done in the name of religion, right? These are done in the name of political ideology, maybe even anti-religious, like Soviet atheism. It's an anti-religious ideology. They sought to exterminate religion. Or it may be done in the name of a religious ideology that has nothing to do with Islam, right, as we mentioned. It may be done in the name of violence, may be done in the name of Enlightenment ideas, right, as in the French Revolution with 40,000 beheadings. So as the, you know, and we see this in the case of contemporary atrocities that are happening throughout the world. So one psychologist, Professor Ian Robertson, he said when you actually look at movements that commit acts of violence, you find certain patterns. Okay, it actually has nothing to do with what, you know, do they believe in this religion or that religion or this, you know, secular belief system or that belief system. It has to do with the way that they deal with beliefs and their psychological attitudes. So what are their psychological attitudes? Well, one thing he mentions is savagery begets savagery, okay? The way that, people experience violence and savagery, it causes them in turn to commit acts of violence and savagery towards others. Number two, submersion in the group. Okay, so when people are immersed into a group, this concept that you know, Ibn Khaldun called asabiya, when people have this attachment to a group that becomes extreme and absolutist, right? They no longer can think that anyone outside the group has possibly any good in them. Everybody who's part of the group is good, everyone outside the group is evil. The out group is dehumanized as objects. And then they have this motive of revenge. They did this to us, we'll do worse to them. And fanatical leaders that end up taking over the group. You know, the leader, whatever the leader says is right, never question the leader. So, why do these violent groups exist? Because for Muslims, it's not enough for us to simply say, well, Islam doesn't preach violence. The next question that people ask is, well, then why do these groups exist? How do they justify what they're doing? And so we have to academically answer that as well and show that why that explanation that religion is the cause is a faulty explanation. So if Islam doesn't preach violence, where are these groups coming from? Well, the first point to note is that anyone who studied how these groups use religious texts, they point out that they're not actually sincere in the way that they use religious texts. And you saw that in how the verses of the Quran are misquoted, right? So they privilege those proof texts that conform to their ideological presuppositions, ignoring or explaining away those that do not. So they'll use whatever they can and twist it to fit their own ideology. So where do they come from? Three different factors we can think about. And I give the analogy of a fire, okay? So a fire has, you know, three different ingredients that keep a fire going, right? If you miss out on any of those ingredients, the fire goes out. So one is the fuel. Okay, the fire needs fuel in order for it to run. So if somebody wants to start a fire, they have to bring some firewood. The second is that it needs heat, and the third is that it needs air or oxygen, and that's what keeps the fire going. Now, when it comes to violent movements, there are three factors as well. So the fuel of these violent movements is they prey on the suffering of the people. They prey on a brutalized population, a population that has experienced tremendous suffering and atrocities. And then they bring in the heat. What is the heat? It's an ideology of fanaticism, an ideology of dehumanization, that everyone who disagrees with us is not worthy of living, is subhuman, that kind of dehumanization. And then the political turmoil. They thrive in situations where there's political chaos and instability. So when you look at violent movements that commit violence in the name of Islam, what are some of the ideas that you find recurring in these movements? One is the interpretation of wala wal bara to mean dehumanization of outsiders in a manner that is totally distant from the sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam was the most compassionate human being. And yet you find this distortion of the concept of loving and hating for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to entail something that, anyone who disagrees with us is not worthy of living. This dehumanization that is perpetrated. And then the second thing is this idea that if we have a leader whom we call the Khalifa, just having that is going to automatically bring about a utopia. It will solve all the problems in the Muslim world. Educational crisis, literacy, jobs, employment, scientific advancement, everything's going to be magically solved by having that utopia. And if you want to look at a more academic treatment of the concept of Khilafah, look at the article that Yaqeen Institute published recently by Uwaymer Anjam, called Who Wants the Khilafah and what it really means in Sunni Islam. The third one is anyone who disagrees, there's takfir. Okay, what is takfir? It is pronouncing the one who, pronouncing somebody to be a disbeliever, pronouncing somebody to be a kafir. So anyone who disagrees is automatically considered to be upon kufr. And not just that, but then the dehumanization of that person. Okay? And then fourthly, this idea that jihad is an end in and of itself. Now there's an interesting statement by Al-Izz ibn Abd salam, famous Muslim legal theorist, in his work Qawaid al-Ahkam, talking about legal maxims. He outlines basically a theory of Islam's ethical rules and principles, okay, that underlies Islamic jurisprudence. So he mentions a very interesting point. So he says, one cannot come closer to God through any type of harm or evil. Okay? That's why the Prophet Muhammad said when praising God that all good is in your hands and nothing bad is for you. Okay, so no evil is attributed to you, meaning nothing bad can be a means of drawing closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. For one can only come closer to God through the categories of benefit and goodness and not through the types of harm and evil. This is unlike the unjust rulers, with whom one may achieve closeness through acts of evil, like usurping wealth, killing others, oppressing people, spreading corruption, manifesting sinfulness, destroying lands. These are things that can bring somebody closer to an unjust ruler, but you can't come closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala by committing these evil actions. One only comes close to the Lord of Lords, the creator and sustainer of the universe, through truth and righteousness. Then he mentions something very interesting. He says, if it is said, what about jihad? Jihad is destruction, loss of life and wealth, but it is a means of closeness to God. He said, we reply, no, it is not a means of closeness to God through destruction. Rather, it only becomes a means of closeness to God insofar as it leads to the removal of harm and the attainment of benefit. Okay? So in other words, when there is a military struggle, it has to be for a just cause. And it has to occur within just parameters. It cannot allow the killing of civilians, of non-combatants. Right? As you saw from the quote from Abdullah bin Abbas radiallahu anhuma, it cannot entail the destruction of even plants, right? The destruction of livestock. It has certain parameters, and it has to be for the sake of justice. It has to be for the sake of a just cause. And that's what Imam Ibn al-Qayyim rahimahullah also mentions. He says that fighting is only commanded as a response to warfare. Okay? لا في مقابلة الكفر, not in response to disbelief. For this reason, neither women are to be killed, nor children, nor the elderly, nor the blind, nor those monks who do not fight. Rather, the command and prescription for fighting in Islam is restricted against those who wage war against us. That's what he mentions. That's the ethical philosophy in Islam. We mentioned the Islamic emphasis on peace right at the beginning, on non-violence, right? Because spilling of bloodshed is the reason for which angels asked Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, why even create human beings? Right? It's a reason why human beings should not exist if human beings engage in bloodshed. The only reason why a just exercise of force is permitted is to prevent somebody from doing harm and transgression, to prevent the spread of evil and corruption. And that's the ethical philosophy that the scholars of Islam elaborated. And we have many articles that discuss that and further. So if you look at the Islamic tradition which talks about jihad al-talab and jihad al-daf', so we have articles that go into what exactly were the jurists outlining as the parameters for these concepts. Now, when it comes to fanatical ideology, where is it taking its inspiration from? It's not coming from Islam. It's actually drawing its inspiration from a variety of secular ideologies. The idea of consequentialism, of collateral damage. They did this to us, we're going to do worse to them. Because this is the ends justify the means. The idea of emphasizing political revolution as a means to achieve reform and positive change in the Muslim world. These different ideologies are used instead. So we're going to look at another video that talks about specifically the rise of violent movements. This is the second video from the article.
Is Islam to blame for violent groups? Based on an article by Dr. Nazir Khan. The Prophet ﷺ said, "Worship God, the most merciful, and spread peace." There is clear evidence from Islamic religious texts that show that Islam condemns violence, and history shows that violence does not come from any religious teachings. But if religion does not teach violence, where do violent groups come from? And why do they perpetrate their crimes in the name of Islam? Violent groups do not emerge in a vacuum. Research shows us that violent groups emerge in situations of prolonged oppression, warfare, political instability, and so on. Think of it like a fire starting. It needs 3 ingredients: air, fuel, and heat. In the same way, violent groups require 3 ingredients. 1, political instability. 2, a brutalized and suffering population. And 3, fanatical leaders with a totalitarian ideology creating an existential narrative that will appeal to those near and afar. The way these factors work are easy to see in light of recent events in the Middle East. For example, in Iraq, we see the long story of human suffering and political turmoil. After a decade of oppressive regimes and economic sanctions which killed 227,000 Iraqis, the 2003 invasion of Iraq killed up to 700,000 civilians in just 3 years. Their suffering is hard to fathom. The city of Fallujah alone had 14 times as many radiation-related birth defects than Hiroshima and Nagasaki combined. This chaotic period of history gave birth to criminals, soldiers, fanatics, and rebels. The result? ISIS. Political chaos and instability result in opportunist groups seeking to take power by any means necessary. The New York Times reported that many of the leading generals in ISIS were former military officers under the preceding secularist regime. Did they experience a sudden religious awakening overnight? Or is it far more likely that opportunistic, power-hungry individuals were eager to do anything to get back into power? The answer is obvious. These political groups drew upon religious terms and themes, but gave them new meanings associated with destruction and violence. For example, according to the Quran, jihad is about striving to uphold virtue for the sake of God, while violent groups hijack the word to use it for their terrorist actions. People who join these violent groups often lack basic familiarity with the Islamic teachings. In fact, an MI5 research document reported, far from being religious zealots, a large number of those involved in terrorism do not practice their faith regularly. Many lack religious literacy and could actually be regarded as religious novices. Some are involved in drug taking, drinking alcohol, and visiting prostitutes. There is evidence that a well-established religious identity actually protects against violent radicalization. So what does all of this mean? It means that Islam is the faith of 1.8 billion people and is not the cause of violence. The real causes of violence relate to political instability, warfare, repressive regimes, prolonged human suffering, and fanatical leaders who construct an ideology of hatred and dehumanization. To quote the editorial board of the New York Times, To claim that this savagery is rooted in a certain people or a certain religion is to forget that the great atrocities of our age have been perpetrated on different continents by people professing different ideologies and different religions. Before the Islamic State, there was Rwanda and the Lord's Resistance Army, and the killing fields of Cambodia, and before that in Europe, the Holocaust. By educating ourselves, we can work to counter narratives of hate and xenophobia, and focus on finding solutions to the injustices and suffering of all people around the world.
So the next thing to talk about is, there's been a lot of research about what are the different steps that happen, when a population is at risk of undergoing a genocide. And so one of the famous pieces of work in this regard is by Gregory Stanton. It's called The 8 Steps to Genocide. So he talks about, different things that happen in a society that can lead towards a genocide. And the first is classification. So people have a us versus them mentality, right? And what are the different solutions that you can do at each stage to prevent things from getting worse? So classification in and of itself may not be a bad thing. If you have a multicultural society where people recognize that people come from different backgrounds, but you also emphasize shared traits within the society, right? So we as Muslims we value belief, right? And we consider kufr to be something evil, but as Muslims we emphasize the shared humanity, and we follow the sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ and the teachings of the Quran. لا ينهاكم الله عن الذين لم يقاتلوكم في الدين ولم يخرجوكم من دياركم أن تبروهم وتقسطوا إليهم إن الله يحب المقسطين. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not forbid you or dissuade you from those who are not fighting you on account of your religion. They're not driving you out of your homes, that you deal with them with bir, with the utmost level of respect and good treatment. وَتُقْسِطُوا إِلَيْهِمْ, and that you deal with them with justice. Verily Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala loves those who are just. So in the steps that he talks about, really a key turning point is the step of dehumanization. When you say that this person, is subhuman, you denigrate them. And right now, Islamophobia is doing that to Muslims. Right? Muslims are experiencing that. When you look at some of the rhetoric about Muslims, people saying things like Muslims are deranged by their beliefs, Muslims are irrational, they're crazy people, violent, savage people. Right? This is dehumanizing. The Muslims are no longer normal human beings, are worthy of respect and kindness. It's a dehumanizing narrative. So when we talk about can religion be a force for violence, it can be if somebody takes religious rhetoric and makes it dehumanizing to others. Okay? So we need to be cognizant of such rhetoric. Even within our communities, we need to understand what is the harms of those rhetoric. We're not saying that as Muslims we shouldn't value our identity, and as the Prophet Muhammad said that the tasting the sweetness of faith is you hate to return to kufr, you hate to return to a state of unbelief, being in a state where you don't appreciate that relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But you have to counteract the dehumanizing narrative by emphasizing the teachings of Islam that remind us of the shared humanity, the ethics of how we see outsiders. So for example, the Prophet Muhammad said, لا يؤمن أحدكم حتى يحب لأخيه ما يحب لنفسه. That none of you truly believes until you love for your brother what you love for yourself. So of the scholars of hadith who commented on this hadith, Shihabuddin al-Qastalani, he mentions that the word brother here is inclusive of both Muslim and non-Muslim. As a brother in humanity. So having that shared love for humanity, and that's supported by another riwayah of the same hadith, that's narrated in the Musnad of Imam Ahmed, where the Prophet Muhammad says, لا يبلغ العبد حقيقة الإيمان حتى يحب للناس ما يحب لنفسه من الخير. That a worshipper, a servant of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not reach the true reality of faith until they love for humanity the same goodness that they love for themselves. Also the Prophet Muhammad said that من كان يؤمن بالله واليوم الآخر فليحسن إلى جاره. Whoever believes in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the last day must treat his or her neighbor with excellence. And this ethics of neighborliness, there's something emphasized in the Quran as well. وَجَارِ ذِي الْقُرْبَى وَالْجَارِ الْجُنُبِ, right? Some of the scholars of tafsir, they mentioned that the distant neighbor, the near neighbor, what is being emphasized here? There's a neighbor with whom you share the closeness of neighborliness and also the bond of faith. And there's also the rights of the neighbor with whom you share the relationship of them being your neighbor. You may not share the same faith with them, but they have rights over you still. And that's the ethics that we need to understand when we're talking about the relationship between Muslims and non-Muslims. It's not taking verses of the Quran that apply to warfare with those who are fighting you. It's taking the verses of the Quran that apply to relationships with one's neighbor, the outside community. Okay, and then you understand that neighborly ethics in Islam and how it applies to that. And Imam al-Qurtubi, rahimahullah, he explains this applies to both Muslims and non-Muslim neighbors. The Prophet Muhammad ﷺ emphasized, when it comes to our charitable acts towards others. The Prophet Muhammad ﷺ said, "Tasaddaqu ala ahli al-adyani kulliha." Right? He said, donate in charity to people of all faiths. In the Musannaf of Ibn Abi Shaybah. So this understanding that our concern as human beings is not limited only to Muslims. Rather, we want good for all of humanity. That's the ethics that we have as Muslims towards others. And when we emphasize that within our communities, it will also be clearer for Muslims to know how to respond to this Islamophobic narrative that tries to equate Islam with violence. So these are some of the resources that Yaqeen Institute has made available for people. You'll find all of these YouTube videos on the website. You'll find these resources on the website. And on a weekly basis, Yaqeen Institute is releasing new papers covering different topics. So pretty much all of the common misconceptions that people have about Islam have already been covered. Now we're translating those misconceptions into animated videos, into infographics, into curriculum that is being disseminated to Islamic schools, and to masajid, to MSAs, so that people can start using this material and changing the narrative, changing the discourse, starting to talk about the reality of the Islamic teachings, and understanding it better for ourselves. So I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to enable us to acquire the proper understanding of our faith and to purify our hearts and to guide us along the straight path. هذا وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. وجزاكم الله خيرا. Inshallah ta'ala, if anyone has any questions, we can open the floor for questions and discussion. Yes, Jazakallah khair.
I find them, they are very knowledgeable. This is not, they are spreading out of ignorance. They know very well exactly what they are doing. So as a community, in this great country, what can we do? How can we continue to educate our kids and our community to be ready to respond to some of the concerns you mentioned?
This is an excellent question. So the question was, the people who are spreading the Islamophobic narrative, these are not ignorant people. They are experts. They are people who are conducting a major amount of research. So what can we as Muslims do to counteract that? In fact, to take it further, if you look at the Islamophobia industry, because it's an entire industry, there are multiple billions of dollars that are being invested into spreading hate against Muslims. And how that money is being invested, we've conducted the research that tracks this. You can see that money is being invested in these organizations that are, first they get the quote-unquote academics, the experts, those people with Middle Eastern study degrees, those people who have the literacy skills that they can go through the Muslim sources and pick and choose. They can create a very convincing picture of the information of this is what Islamic texts are saying, this is what Islamic sources are saying, this is what is, don't take what Muslims tell you, look at what their sources are actually saying. So you have people like Robert Spencer, Jihad Watch, all of these different people pumping out material constantly, funded by a massive industry. And then this group of intellectuals, then they pass that information off to to the spokespeople, the people who are the media pundits, the people who are the influencers who come out as the talking heads on Fox News and CNN and MSNBC and all these different organizations. And anytime there's an event that happens, well, they say, well, we're inviting this expert to talk about Islam and whatever. So then you have the media narrative that comes out as well. And you have policy that is developed around this. So people who are in politics are influenced by these narratives, and they push forward policy that is Islamophobic in nature. So now Muslims, what have we been doing all along? This has been going on for 10, 20 years, and what have we been investing in? Mashallah, we've built nice masajid, we've made resources to get halal meat. But what about our intellectual resources as Muslims? Where have we invested our resources? So Yaqeen Institute is something that is providing us with our own megaphone to counteract this narrative. So we bring together the think tank, the intellectuals, to go back to the sources, to research, to find how they're constructing the Islamophobic narrative and dismantle that narrative intellectually. And then the influencers, the spokespeople, the media people, the people who can create the animated content, the infographics, the social media material that can then be easily disseminated to counteract that media narrative. We used to complain and say, what can we do? The media is against us. Now we have our own media. It's on social media. We have our own opportunities. We have no excuse to sit back and allow that narrative to continue to spread against us. So we have to support these intellectual efforts in our community, to have Muslim intellectuals speak out, explain what are the true teachings of Islam, explain the true understanding of the deen in our community, so our own youth understand their connection to the deen, understand what are the values, what does it mean to be Muslim, and counteract that Islamophobic narrative that's being pushed against us. It's an excellent question. Jazakallah khair. Any other questions? Yes.
And you see that those accounts have been cancelled and they have been kicked out of the groups and all those kind of things. So how to tackle that?
Yeah, I think that may be true in some cases, but not all cases. Social media, there's censorship that happens for sure. There are different narratives that are pushed. But what Yaqeen Institute has actually done is we've made a lot of progress on that front as well. So we had Sheikh Omar Sulaiman went and he met with Google. And he sat down with Google, and initially Google said, no, we have our algorithm. If somebody types in Islam and the first 10 results that come up are all Islamophobic websites, too bad. That's what comes up. But we met with them and we said, look, you are responsible for the hate narrative that is being pushed, for the factually incorrect information that is being pushed. And when they realized the harm that it was doing, they said, okay, you know what? We're going to what we'll do is we'll give you a fair playing field. And so now when you search up many of the Islamic terms and contents on Google, you find Yaqeen websites come up before even the Islamophobic narratives. Because now we have a fair playing field. We can counteract their narrative with the correct information. In the same way, people are more aware now. Facebook, for example, they're aware of how it played a role in the last election, of a lot of misinformation that people had, because people can go onto Facebook and be in a bubble where they're constantly seeing news items that reinforce their own views, even if those news pages are not real. The whole fake news. Everything's fake news. Well, how does that fake news get circulated? You have these different clusters of networks on Facebook, and so somebody logs onto Facebook and they have their circle, and and the news items that are recommended to them are recommended through an algorithm that is looking at who they like. So if they like all these people who are Islamophobic, they'll keep seeing media items that are saying, oh, Muslims did this and Muslims did that. So it reinforces that. Now they're realizing that is totally harmful and destructive. So the technology has evolved quite a bit, and the policy hasn't kept up with it. But now things are starting to change, and people are realizing the harms associated with that. So we have an amazing team of engineers with Yaqeen who are constantly looking at the algorithms and looking at what puts the content at the top of somebody's search results or at the top of their social media feed? And how do we get our content there so that if somebody has a question, they are able to find the right answer? They don't go to some misinformation. We have a team of experts just in computer sciences and engineering to track that information. So not only do we have the Islamic scholars, the psychologists, the scientists, we also have the computer software people, the computer engineers. We have the people doing that search algorithm engineering as well. Alhamdulillah. Any other questions? No? Okay, Jazakumullah khairan. It's a pleasure to have come out and joined your community. I'll be available afterwards if anyone wants to come and speak to me individually. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
I'd like to thank Dr. Nazir for coming, visiting us, and giving us a wonderful lecture. Jazakumullah khair.
Oh, really? Oh, no way. Oh, in Ajax, yes, subhanAllah. I know a lot of people went to Ajax, yes.